Vinton, do we have to record right now? I'm kind of tired. I just want to go back to sleep.
Yeah, me too. But we have an early meeting for recording.
But it's still dark outside.
Well, we just got to record some things down.
Why do we record like we're running out of time?
Shh.
Come back to bed. No, wait. Wait.
That'll be about enough of that.
That's enough.
Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Dane.
And I am Robbie Herlocker.
And we are nearing the end of our musical. And I'm sad.
I'm sad, but I'm also proud.
Oh, I'm proud too.
We've made it so far. This is great. Lin-Manuel Miranda put so many words into this musical, I almost didn't expect that we would make it this far. He wrote like he was running out of time, so to speak.
That's right. Yeah, I did not expect it to come so fast.
It did come fast, didn't it? But we've been putting these episodes out since when? Was it February? I mean, we discussed this at the end of last year when we decided to put this podcast together.
Yeah, so it's been a while. So we're starting off today with Best of Wives and Best of Women.
This song is really sweet and intimate. I love this.
Yeah, it's a great short song, and I think it's a great way to lead into the duel.
Right. This is the moment that if you have not cried enough in the second act, you might get a little bit of a tearjerker thinking onto this song, because this is the representation of the final correspondence between Alexander Hamilton and Eliza Hamilton, his wife, before he goes off to the duel.
And you know what's coming up. You know something's changing. Something's getting dark here. You hear that tune of It's Quiet Uptown kind of coming back in this song. And there's that foreshadowing of another unimaginable loss.
Right, that's exactly true. In the staging of this musical, you see that Alexander is sitting down in a chair. He has his little lap desk there where he's writing a letter, and he is composing this letter to his next of kin, so to speak. And he's leaving a letter for Eliza for when she wakes up, just in case he does not make it through this duel alive. But before Hamilton finishes composing his whole letter, Eliza, in her nightgown, walks out on stage, rubbing her eyes, is sleepy, obviously, and walks toward Hamilton and says, "Hey, Alexander, come back to sleep." And the whole conversation happens, as you'd imagine, a wife discovering that her husband is awake at his desk, and she walks out and just begs him to come back and just sleep the night away. And since he's so obsessed with working, she finally says, "Well, I'm going back to sleep." And you see that little intimate moment between them where there's not a lot of action happening on stage, but there's a lot of meaningful looks, a lot of meaningful moments, because we know more than Eliza knows in this song.
That's right. In the staging, it's very simple. Hamilton's sitting in the chair writing. Eliza comes out and talks to him and then walks back off at the end of the song. But there are a lot of subtle, small things to catch. The lyrics here start out with Eliza saying, "Alexander, come back to sleep." In the history here, Alexander actually wrote this letter on July 4th, about a week before the duel.
That's right. Whereas most duels, to avoid being detected by the public so that they're prevented, most duels take place in a really short amount of time between the challenge being issued and then the challenge being accepted and then the duel happening. In this case, there was almost a month span between Hamilton and Burr agreeing to do a duel and then setting this date of the duel. So they had a lot of time to take care of their affairs, put everything in order. Hamilton requested this later date probably because he had a lot of creditors he had to pay off. He had some affairs he needed to deal with. He also had some legal court proceedings that he wanted to make sure got taken care of. And he didn't feel like, as a lawyer, he would be doing his clients justice if he went to a duel that could potentially take his life away and then put them in a position where they have to now disclose all of their information to a new lawyer to give them new representation and go through all of that. So he wanted to be able to go through all of his actions, take care of all of his cases as best he could, put everything in order, and then go to this duel.
Yeah, but our musical here collapses this into a one-night thing for dramatic effect. In history, though, that night before the duel, he spent downtown while Eliza was uptown at home. And one of Hamilton's sons, who would later become his first biographer, wrote an account of that final night saying, "He entered the room, gazed pensively at the boy, and asked if he would share his bed that night. Hamilton soon retired, and placing the boy's little hands on his own, he repeated with him the Lord's Prayer. The child then fell asleep in his arms. This image of Hamilton sleeping with his arms wrapped around an orphaned youth during his last night on Earth is inexpressibly poignant and makes one think that his own tormented boyhood weighed on his mind that night.
Right, so that's a reminder that Hamilton was taking in orphans through most of his marriage with Eliza. They had adopted a few orphans, taken them in, and in this scene, you see him intimately taking care of sleeping right next to this child, holding him in his arms, letting the boy's fingers wrap around his hand, and it's very sweet, very intimate. Some historians look back on this, whereas Hamilton's son James is writing this and say it's not really necessarily completely true. It may have been elaborated. It could have been something that was put into the writings to justify and vindicate his father's character in certain ways. Regardless of that, we do know for a fact that he was a person who consistently through his life was protecting orphans, taking them in.
Right.
And so whether this happened the night before he died or not is not really the point. It still speaks to his character that he was taking care of them. And the best we know, this is what happened. The best account that we have is from his son who wrote this, and it's a very emotional time. It just wasn't the time that we see in the staging of this musical between Eliza and Alexander. We see him instead on his own with his son in the house and then this orphan child as well.
The lyrics continue on with Hamilton telling Eliza he has an early meeting out of town. Eliza says, it's still dark outside. And then Hamilton says, I know. That I know there, and later in a couple of lines, he's going to say, shh. Both remind me of Stay Alive reprise when he's saying, I know.
Right, where Philip is on his deathbed and he's looking up at his father, and there's something very final in this scene and in their voice, and you see that Hamilton is trying to comfort Philip on his deathbed, and here you see him using those same words to Eliza, trying to comfort her.
He says, I just need to write something down. He's following the 10 duel commandments, leaving a note for his next of kin.
Obviously, in the next lines, we see one of those callbacks that comes up frequently again in this musical, where Eliza just mentions Hamilton's characteristics of writing like he's running out of time, just saying, why do you write like you're running out of time? In this context, it's almost like a wife wanting her husband to work a little less, be a little more present at home, and just be with her instead of retreating to his work, to his writings, to his pen and paper. And so when he shushes her there and she just begs him, come back to bed, that would be enough. It's that beckoning to him, saying, hey, just be present with me, be in my presence. And there's that very intimate invitation again, saying, come back to bed, which is telling, since in the song Burn, she said, you forfeit your rights to this place.
That seals the deal on that marriage healing thing for me. Obviously, things are never going to be the same, but they showed you in the musical that there was a healing coming about, and her inviting him back to the bed there is almost like it going full circle, that return, that healing.
Forgiveness. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
It's so good. I also love the idea of the way that would be enough as a phrase is used in the progression of this musical. I saw a comment somewhere online where someone was talking about how Eliza keeps lowering the standards for him, going from the war to, say, spending a few minutes to me to just come sleep next to me, and so then that would be enough for me. In my eyes, though, this progression of how Eliza uses this request and then saying that would be enough to her husband is really a movement towards intimacy, where you see at the very beginning she says, just stay alive through the Revolutionary War, and that would be enough. I just want you to be alive, the basics of life. I don't want you to die. And then she says later in the song Nonstop that she's asking for a fraction of his time, that she wants him to spend time with her. Don't just be alive, spend some of your life with me presently. And then in this final articulation of the phrase, she uses it as an invitation to him, saying, come to bed with me, come lay in our marital bed. This is an invitation to intimacy. So it's almost like from the beginning of the musical to now, she's been moving closer and closer to the intimacy she's always wanted with him from the beginning.
Right. And Hamilton responds with, I'll be back before you know I'm gone. And historians will argue even to this day back and forth over what his state of mind was, if he thought he was coming back, if he thought this was going to be a suicide mission or what. And we have no way of knowing.
Right. Chernow has a lot of beef with people who call it a suicide mission. Chernow, in his biography, writes a lot of things about the lead up to the Burr-Hamilton duel. And he says that every person who ever interacted with Hamilton in the days leading up to the duel said that Hamilton was really jovial and happy and lighthearted, which, to be fair, that's not actually a sign of whether someone's depressed or not. If they're publicly putting on a happy face, that doesn't mean they're not privately depressed. However, Chernow puts a lot of stock in that, and then he talks about how he was just following this religious conviction to throw away his shot rather than some type of suicidal mission or this dream of dying in glory with a gunshot instead of living to his old age and dying. So Chernow is very argumentative towards people that want to call it a suicide mission. But at the same time, we can't totally discredit that because we're not in Hamilton's head. You're right. There is a lot of debate back and forth about how sound his judgment is while he's preparing for the duel.
And Eliza presents that final plea, come back to sleep. And Hamilton said, this meeting's at dawn.
Right. And we as the audience have been able to pick up on a few different key clues in the language that Hamilton uses throughout this. He says this is a meeting that's out of town and it's at dawn. We can kind of connect the dots because we know that this is a setup for a duel. When you do it early in the morning, you do it somewhere out of town where people are not able to see you exactly. And so we almost hear this as Hamilton wanting Eliza to know certain details, but still refusing to give her the full disclosure. I don't think he wants to worry her unnecessarily, but he does want to provide for her just in case. He probably also expects that she'll talk him out of the duel, and he wants to go with his honor intact. So there's a lot of reasons for why he wouldn't have told Eliza to begin with. But in this context, it's almost like it's on the tip of his tongue, like he wants to tell his partner how much he is fearing what he's about to do, but he doesn't give her all the details.
And that last line there of Eliza speaking to Hamilton before he goes to this fatal duel, well, I'm going back to sleep.
I love that.
And I read online, reading some comments, that this is actually a common trope in fiction. And actually, it's common in the real world, too, that the last thing we say to those that we love is usually something flippant, and it's not something of importance or of weight. It's not an I love you and I care deeply for you. It's just a flippant remark. And I really see that in that. Oh, I'm going back to bed.
Right.
I'm not going to argue with you anymore.
Which is a normal conversation to have with your significant other before you retire for the night and go back to sleep. That just makes sense that you would say it like that. But Eliza doesn't understand and could not understand, given all the details she has, how grave this moment is. You don't always get to know when it is the last moment you'll get to speak to your loved ones. So here, it's that flippant. Well, I'm too tired. I'm not going to stay up with you just watching you write. I'm going back to bed.
And I like that Hamilton catches her there with that, hey, which is also the first thing he said to her.
Hey.
That's right. So you got the bookends there.
Right. As far as the staging goes, when Hamilton was writing, Eliza had come up and she had her arms around Hamilton's shoulders and was massaging his neck and hugging him from behind. And when she started to walk off, that's when Hamilton grabbed her hand and looked at her in the eyes. And for the first time, they're looking at each other directly. And he uses that line that is the tearjerker that I'm sure is now engraved into a few different wedding bands already.
Right.
Best of wives and best of women.
Yeah, I love that. He grabs her hand and he kisses it and says, best of wives and best of women. I just love that line.
Right. That's the tagline of this July 4th letter that he did leave for his wife, Eliza. And since it's a fairly short letter, just 3 or 4 paragraphs, depending on how you break it down, I'm going to go ahead and read this for you just briefly because it's a very intimate moment. It's the letter that is the inspiration for this scene on the stage. And so I want to just go into this. This letter, my very dear Eliza, will not be delivered to you unless I shall first have terminated my earthly career. To begin, as I humbly hope from redeeming grace and divine mercy, a happy immortality. If it had been possible for me to have avoided the interview, my love for you and my precious children would have been alone a decisive motive. But it was not possible, without sacrifices which would have rendered me unworthy of your esteem. I need not tell you of the pangs I feel, from the idea of quitting you and exposing you to the anguish which I know you would feel. Nor could I dwell on that topic, lest it should unman me. The consolations of religion, my beloved, can alone support you, and these you have a right to enjoy. Fly to the bosom of your God, and be comforted. With my last idea, I shall cherish the sweet hope of meeting you in a better world. Adieu, best of wives and best of women, Embrace all my darling children for me. Ever yours, A.H.
So beautiful. And on an interesting note there, Chernow actually dedicates his book to his wife using that same phrase. And then in the playbill for Hamilton, Miranda thanks his wife, Vanessa, using that same phrase.
Right. It's definitely an inspirational phrase for these men who have written about Hamilton's life. They catch that and they're like, hey, my wife is inspirational in my work. They've done so much for me. If you have the Hamiltome, then you've probably read this marginal note from Lin-Manuel Miranda. It takes up most of the page. It's one of the longest marginal notes in the entire
Right.
tome. And he writes in the margin of this song more words than are actually lyrics in this song, because he writes this message about his wife Vanessa saying, this musical, Hamilton, an American musical, would never have been written if it weren't for Vanessa. She was my first audience. She was the inspiration. She listened to me. She encouraged me. And when I said the premise of my musical that would make most people laugh in my face, she said, okay. And she went with it. And she encouraged me, and she planned the vacations to go see Hamilton's house and to see Hamilton's birthplace and to see these places. She got invested with me, and if not for her, I could never have accomplished all of this. And so we went on vacations to these places, and while I wrote, she was able to enjoy the sightseeing, and we had this fun interaction because Lin-Manuel Miranda and his wife Vanessa were able to really dive into this together and support each other. So it's really sweet, the words that Lin-Manuel Miranda writes to Vanessa in the margin there. I just encourage you to go pick up the book and read that for yourself because it's really encouraging.
With that, I dedicate this podcast to my wife, Tessa. Best of wives and best of women.
Oh, that's so sweet. So as I was preparing for this podcast episode today, I went for a jog. And I decided I would listen to the music and get ready into the mindset of what we were covering.
Great jogging music.
Right. Best of Wives, Best of Women is not the best jogging music. It's not very fun. But immediately at the end of that song, the music picks up again. And it is incredible jogging music for at least a certain length of time. My encouragement to you is to use Act 1 of Hamilton for jogging music.
Right.
It is so, so helpful. It has pumped you up music. Even the cabinet battles are great to run to. But the first act, you can see the rise, the swell, the fun. It's exciting. When you get to Hercules Mulligan, you finally have a new burst of adrenaline. You can keep running for days when you hear his rap come in. But when you hear the second act, it's like sweat and tears mixing together while you're running. I don't recommend it. But when this music starts, for the song, The World Was Wide Enough, you hear all of the excitement come right back in. We're moving from a scene of intimacy and intimate tension to the scene of aggressive tension and anger and a lot of outward stress and frustration in this actual duel scene.
Yeah. So this song is the culmination of nearly every theme in this whole musical. Everything is coming to a head here. Everything is getting its bookend, if you will, here.
Right. When Burr, in the very beginning of his narration for the first song, says, I'm the fool that shot Hamilton, this is where he shoots Hamilton.
Right. And where Alexander talks about his death in my shot. And both the characters' comments on dueling and 10 duel commandments. Burr's longing for that place in the room where it happens. And Hamilton's obsession with legacy. It's all coming together here.
Every single thread of all of these different themes is meeting its culmination in the climax of our entire musical here. I appreciate the device where Lin-Manuel Miranda has turned the duels into a 3-beat where you have 3 duels presented throughout this musical.
Right.
In the first duel, you get to hear all the 10 duel commandments and they explain it to you. The first duel is a lot more educational and informative, where you see the 10 duel commandments and that engagement between John Lawrence and Charles Lee. And we don't really care too much about those characters. We love John Lawrence. We absolutely adore him. But he doesn't get hurt in the duel. Charles Lee is the one who gets hurt. So the emotional investment from that first duel is really low. The fallout of it is just Hamilton getting in trouble. There wasn't even a death in that duel. It was just a shot and someone was wounded, and then everything was fine. In the second duel, we have now laid the framework of the instructions of how a duel works, but we're reminding you of them because Philip needed to be instructed on how to do a duel. This is my very first duel. They don't exactly cover this in boarding school, so Hamilton teaches his son how to duel, the things he learned while he was growing up and while he was in the war. He shows him how to do it, and so you're still learning a little bit, but there's that emotional investment now because you do care about a Hamilton and a Hamilton dying. In this final scene, we've done all of that groundwork, all that preliminary work, so we don't have to teach you how a duel works anymore. Lin-Manuel has done such a brilliant job of educating us through this musical that now this song is just pure emotional attachments. And yes, there is new details, new facts, new historical data that's played out, but it's more of the storytelling aspects instead of the, let me instruct you on how a duel happens because we're now prepped for it.
One of the things I like in the staging that's happening while this song starts is every once in a while this bullseye looking light flashes on the stage. And I think that's just really good lighting for what's about to be happening.
Right, of course.
And of course, as a duel song would start, it starts off with counting. The company comes in and starts counting. They count up to 9, and Burr says, there are 10 things you need to know. Number 1.
We rode across the Hudson at dawn. My friend William P. Van Ness signed on as my number 2, which is a nice little streamline between the number 1 and number 2, because
right.
Van Ness is his second in this duel. Van Ness has had a relationship with Burr for a long time. He's been a friend. He's had some overlapping correspondence with Hamilton as well. So this is a guy that they all knew together. But this person would be representing Burr in all the correspondence, the back and forth, trying to reach a peace with Alexander Hamilton.
And speaking of rowing, there's this interesting note I found online that was interjected here that Alexander Hamilton Woods, a descendant of Hamilton's, and Antonio Burr, a descendant of one of Burr's cousins, now go kayaking together. And another absurd fact is that Lin-Manuel Miranda and Antonio Burr were actually neighbors, and Miranda credits Antonio for changing his perspective on Burr.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just a little side note, a little bonus of history, and a little bonus of contemporary events that reference back to it. Lin-Manuel Miranda, in a tweet about a year and a half ago, thanked Antonio Burr, saying that he wanted to thank him for that one roaring, drunken conversation. I wish I could have been in the room where that happened,
right.
Where he forever changed how Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote the character of Aaron Burr. So this guy has a great-great-great-great-grandfather who is, and I don't know how many greats it really is, but he has a great ancestor of Aaron Burr. And so he's clearly invested in his legacy and determining how he behaved and what his motives were and what his insight was. And so the idea of Lin-Manuel Miranda hanging out with Aaron Burr's great-great-great-great-grandkids is kind of interesting.
And as you mentioned, I really like how when he introduces his second, he says, signed on as my, and then him and the company, number 2. Hamilton arrived with his crew, Nathaniel Pendleton, and a doctor that he knew.
That's right. Now we have all 4 parties. In corner number 1, we have Aaron Burr with William P. Van Ness standing right outside the ring, massaging his shoulders.
I've never thought about it that way, but this is actually an apt analogy.
And then in corner number 2, you have Alexander Hamilton and Nathaniel Pendleton standing right outside the ring, coaching him, gearing him up with Gatorade.
I also really like that it says Hamilton arrived with his crew. We've talked about how the second act, Hamilton no longer has a crew. I know that these people aren't super close, his crew necessarily, but I do like that he has a crew again.
Yeah, you're right. He doesn't have that trio of close friends that he had in Act 1, but he does have this close friend, David Hosack, who is the doctor that comes onto the scene, that travels with them. He was a family friend. He was a person that had been at a lot of dinner parties with both Burr and Hamilton. He was someone they all knew really well. Hamilton was the one who suggested that they use Dr. David Hosack for the duel. And Aaron Burr had this really curious line in his response to Hamilton when Hamilton suggested using David Hosack as their physician on site. And he said, Hosack is enough, and even that is unnecessary. Turnow puts his comment in there and he says, does this signify that Burr planned to kill Hamilton, making a surgeon superfluous? Did he hope that if wounded, Hamilton would simply bleed to death? Or did he think that nobody would be injured? We'll never know. But one way or another, you do need to have a surgeon there at the site. He needs to turn around so he can have plausible deniability. And the way they did that, the doctor stayed down at the docks by the boatmen instead of going up to the site with the duelists and their seconds.
And an interesting note, Dr. Hosack also treated Philip after the duel. And he had a son named Alexander Hosack, who became Aaron Burr's doctor in his final years.
Oh, interesting.
Number 3. I watched Hamilton examine the terrain. I wish I could tell you what was happening in his brain.
As far as the terrain goes, this was on the eastern banks of the Hudson River, and this was at a supposed cliff. It looked like it was a cliff side that looked like it went straight up from the water to the cliff, and it was just covered with some trees and some weeds. But whenever there was low tide on the river and the water went back a little ways, if you pushed through the weeds and pushed through the trees, there was a small little bank at the bottom of the cliff where you could stand there on dry land. It was, I think, about 22 paces by 11 paces, so just long enough and wide enough for a duel to take place. So this was a frequent location for dueling. The owner of this property was really upset that this was a frequent duel location. And
As you would be.
As he would be. And he said that he could frequently hear the gunshots, but he could never quite get around and see the location of who was dueling there. So he was never able to stop them. But he was really upset that people used this property as a dueling site. But it was a frequent dueling site that was used by a lot of prominent politicians in New York State. Because, remember, even though dueling was illegal in both New York State and New Jersey, even though we say everything is legal in New Jersey, it wasn't quite. It was still a lot more lenient in New Jersey, and it was less frequently and aggressively pursued because in New York, you could hardly get away with it without the prosecution happening.
He continues, "This man has poisoned my political pursuits." And I like that lyrical mirroring of the 10 duel commandments there, because in that same place in the song is where the line was, "This is commonplace, especially between recruits." And it rhymes with that. "This man has poisoned my political pursuits." So I like that rhyming mirror of the songs.
Right. I imagine that when Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote this version of the song, he probably had these two songs right next to each other because he's going through, and the songs do perfectly mirror one another. Even though in this song, we're not giving the commandments of it, we're just giving 10 details about the duel.
And we've already mentioned this, but while in the musical, Hamilton just kept him from being president, in history, he also opposed him as being governor of New York in 1804. So there is a little bit to, at least Burr, feeling like this man has poisoned his political pursuits. It's interesting that that's Burr's perspective, where Hamilton probably would have just said that he was trying to do what's best for his country. He wasn't trying to just harm Burr for the fun of it.
Right. They have a long history of political disagreements, and if it weren't for their political disagreements, they probably would have been pretty close friends, because they did get along really well. They overlapped in a lot of circles. They interacted with each other in parties, and they had lots of ongoing interactions and relationships together. But that political rivalry was incessant and persistent throughout their entire relationship. And all of the attacks from Hamilton were non-stop. Hamilton was frequently accusing Burr of being devoid of principles, saying that he was reckless with his personal money, which is a little bit of a weird accusation considering how much debt Hamilton left in his own accounts. But he said that he's devoid of character, he's reckless with his spending, he's personally a tomcat who is destroying marriages by seducing married women, sleeping around.
Also another ironic bit of accusation there from Hamilton.
From the tomcat himself. And you see that he also accuses him of just only smiling and winning people over with his looks and his personality and never really standing for anything. Nancy Eisenberg, in her book Fallen Founder, we've already brought that book up. It's controversial, but it is intriguing to see her take on all of those accusations, because she basically calls BS on Hamilton's attacks, saying that those aren't the real attacks. The real conflict between the two of them is that they're both New Yorkers vying for support of New Yorkers. And as Hamilton is going out of power, Burr and him are now competing over the same voters, over the same people who have money and the same financial donors. And Burr's now presented as this person who's been shunned by the Republican Party, taken off of the Republican ticket for vice president coming again. And he's just been left out of the governor's seat because of partially some of the things that Hamilton said. Now, his influence is probably overplayed somewhat because Burr lost by a landslide in that governor's election. But all that to be said, their relationship had a lot of things coming to a head here, and it's normal that Burr would have expected that Hamilton is the one who has poisoned all of Burr's political pursuits. Burr has wanted to advance, and Hamilton has been stopping him, writing about him, talking about him, even to the point of this dinner conversation he had with someone that published the response saying that he held a still more despicable opinion of Aaron Burr. And that's what brought us to this duel.
And as a final note on this line, the off-Broadway version is different. It said, "Just apologize, we have worthier pursuits." But that line makes it seem like Burr really doesn't want to do this duel. There's just heavy reluctance here.
Right, and in this point of our musical, we need to see Burr as the person who is actively ambitious pursuing this. We don't need to see that reluctance on his side as far as the story goes. Historically, it's interesting looking at the correspondence. In our last episode, we already discussed how the correspondence went somewhat, and you could see that Burr initially issued this question to Hamilton saying, "Hey, did you talk about my despicable character?" And then Hamilton says, "Hey, you need to be more specific," and all of that. And from that point forward, it's almost as if their interest in the duel mirrored one another or reflected one another's interest. Because early on, Burr was the more professional one who was willing to accept an apology. And early on, Hamilton was the tutorial one who was talking down to Burr. But then by the end of their correspondence, Hamilton's the one saying, "I wish I didn't get to this point. I'm reluctant about it. I hate that I had a part in escalating this." And Burr is the one who says, "No, I am no longer just going to take a general disavow of a specific statement. I need you to specifically disavow ever saying anything general against me." And so he's escalated the terms. He says, "Now I have more reason to be opposing you. I am so opposed to you that I'm not going to accept an apology now unless it is an outward endorsement of me," so to speak. And in that correspondence, you see that at the end of their letters, Burr is really pursuing a duel. And Hamilton is unwilling to back down because he values his honor, he values his legacy, and as a man who still wants to have a political future, as a man who wants to potentially lead a military setting in the future, he can't be seen as someone in the public's eyes who will back down from an interaction like this. He has to be seen as someone brave enough to hold a gun, brave enough to face a gun. And if he had backed out of it, he thought that those people who would talk about it later on would insult me as a coward for backing out of this duel. And so he went into this. He had some reluctance, even though he was very much to blame in certain ways for multiple reasons to bringing them to this point.
The company says that line from 10 Duel Commandments, "Most disputes die and no one shoots," which is odd if you know what's about to happen.
Yeah, and it's definitely odd in the context of this musical since we see 3 duels and all 3 of them involve shots fired.
Right.
Historically, Alexander Hamilton was involved in a lot of duels, which historians use to cast doubt on whether he was truly reserved or whether he truly opposed duels or not. But he had been a second in some duels, or as far as most of the correspondence happening, and some duels had been challenged to him, but he was always able to write his way out. He was always to challenge them in writing, take the high ground, and find an apology that he would be willing to say or force them into an apology or something, so that there was a lot of back and forth. So in Hamilton's experience, most disputes did die with the writing back and forth, with the letters, with the correspondence. Hamilton, this is the first time in his life when he is standing on the field of honor as the principal person about to be shot.
Number 4. Hamilton drew first position, which is one of the few things we know for sure about the duel in history because the seconds had a joint statement that said that both Burr and Hamilton cast lots for the choice of position and to determine whom the word should be given. And Hamilton got both of those.
Right. So in the choice of position, this is who gets to be facing the sun and who gets to be facing away from the sun so that their target's in the shade. And in an interesting choice, Hamilton chose to face towards the water and the sunrise so that the light would be in his eyes, so that he would have the lesser of the positions, and so that Burr would have a better shot looking without the sun blinding him. And so it's an interesting choice that even though he won the draw, he still picked the worst position. And the second thing you're talking about with the person by whom the word would be uttered, it's where Nathaniel Pendleton, Alexander Hamilton's second, got to be the one who said, "Hey, are you ready? Are you ready? Now present arms." And at the word present, you are allowed to fire your shot. And so it was the guy that would give the order, so to speak, to commence the duel.
The next line, "Looking to the world like a man on a mission." And this is interesting grammatically here because until I read the lyrics, I didn't know where those commas were. And the way it's paused when it's being performed, it sounds like looking to the world like a man on a mission. Like he's the one, he's looking to the world.
Oh,
Like
interesting.
he's seeing the world. He's looking at everything in front of him. But grammatically, the commas are looking, comma, to the world, comma, like a man on a mission. Like that's how he appears to the world.
Interesting. That's always the way I've heard it. I always, when I listened to the original cast recording, I would hear him saying, this is the way that Hamilton is looking according to the world. He's
Right.
looking like a man on a mission. He is someone who is examining the terrain very, very carefully, and he did that, which is making his decision all the more curious. But in this context, I hadn't thought of it as him looking externally and looking beyond himself, looking finally to understand that more eyes are on him and he has a mission to accomplish. And the mission, I guess we could say, is to establish his legacy in the eyes of the world. So that's an interesting dual meaning there. I've always
Yeah.
taken it to the one that is with the punctuation, but since it's an audible format, you can take it multiple ways.
This is a soldier with a marksman's ability. And we know Hamilton was a great soldier. We've covered this throughout this podcast.
That line about Hamilton being a soldier with a marksman's ability is interesting to me after reading a number of biographies about him, because a number of Hamilton's friends wrote about how little Hamilton ever handled a firearm after the Revolutionary War. Some of them even theorizing that the night before the duel, when Hamilton was handed the rifles to practice with, people encouraged him, hey, go practice, go put in some practice at the range, try to get some shots in, because presumably and reportedly, a lot of people talked about how Aaron Burr, for months leading up to this, had been practicing with his firearms. He had been practicing a lot leading up to this. Hamilton picked up the gun, lifted his arm up, and put it right back down and said, it's fine. And that was all of his preparation. And one of his friends said, I believe with all my heart that is the first time since the war that he had handled a weapon. And it's interesting. We don't know whether that's true or not. We don't know how extensively he handled a firearm, but we do know that in the Revolutionary War, he had that reputation.
Right? It's a fascinating thing to think about. Like in 10 Duel Commandments, the doctor turns around so he can have deniability. And we've mentioned before, in history, they don't actually just turn around. They will walk off away from the dueling site, be a little bit farther away. And as Chernow notes, the surgeon was expected to be close enough to the duel to heed cries for help, but far enough away to profess ignorance, if necessary, of the whole transaction.
Right. It's a little silly to think that they'd be ignorant of it, because here Dr. David Hosack says, oh, I just happened to drive my canoe up to the same little spot where these guys were fighting, and I heard someone yell help, and I just happened to be banked there at that same location that was kind of out of nowhere. I mean, everybody understood that the doctors knew about it in advance, but they wanted to give them that plausible deniability.
Number 5.
Now, I didn't know this at the time, but we were near the same spot your son died. And I love the way that Hamilton joins Burr on that line, and he says, near the same spot my son died, where you hear both of them reminiscing on that fact, that Burr didn't know it at the moment. Maybe that's why he went around and was examining the terrain so carefully. But I think that it's interesting that we don't get to see inside Hamilton's head a lot in this song until he has his little soliloquy after the gunshot is given. We won't hear his thoughts for a moment, but we do hear him thinking on the fact that Philip died here. And Aaron Burr, moving from number 5 to number 6, says, we were near the same spot your son died. Is that why, 6, he examined the gun with such rigor? I watched as he methodically fiddled with the trigger.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that Hamilton also says, is that why? Right before that, because he can't be asking that same question of why he examined his gun. He knows why he's doing that. So I wonder what that means that Hamilton's asking why. And I almost want to take it into this deep intellectual place of he's just wondering about how the world comes full circle and he's here where his son was. Even though he's set up a lot of that, he's just wondering about why the world works the way it does and why things come full circle so often.
Right, because as far as his voice comes in, he comes in for that line and then fades out. And we don't know how he would finish the sentence.
Right.
We don't know what he is thinking about. What questions are running through your mind when you know that you could possibly be in your last seconds of being alive? What thoughts are flashing through your mind? And we will get to see an insight into that momentarily, but right now in this line, we don't know. About those gun triggers, a lot of historians have looked back on it, and in the 70s, they had this large celebration to commemorate the duel in Weehawken, New Jersey, and they had the pistols there, and some of the commentators there discovered this hair trigger that was inside of these pistols to where it could be manipulated so that if you set it a certain way, it could fire much more quickly without having to pull very hard on the trigger, whereas most of those pistols, you would have to pull hard, you would risk moving your shot off of aim a little bit, but here, these guns were very much set on a hair trigger. Chernow talks about how historians were not surprised by that when all the commentators discovered it. They said that in the correspondence, the seconds when they were talking about it, Nathaniel Pendleton talked about how when he presented his arm to Hamilton, he said, Hamilton, hey, do you want me to set the hair trigger on this shot? And Hamilton said, no, not this time.
Which I love. Like he's going to have multiple other times after this.
Which he really did have a possibility of that, because some duels, if you don't hit your target on the first shot, you try to work it out between the two of you, and then you possibly have a second shot.
That's
if you
right.
can't figure it out. Hamilton, in his correspondence, was very explicit about how he was going to throw away his first shot. He was going to waste his shot and let his life be exposed to Aaron Burr as the person who could take a shot at him. We don't know whether Hamilton was also going to throw away his second shot. Some historians have looked back on that and said he had reserved the possibility that if Aaron Burr was vindictive enough to ask for a second chance to shoot Hamilton, then Hamilton would have seen it as self-defense to raise his gun and shoot in that moment.
Yeah, interesting perspective on that. And we've mentioned it before, but just in case you don't remember, these are the same pistols owned by John Baker Church used in the Philip duel.
Right. It's the same exact guns. I wonder if Hamilton had the gun that killed his son, or if Hamilton had the gun that his son was holding.
That's a really interesting thought. Yeah.
I have no idea. I don't know if anybody knows that. If you have found correspondence and you know about that historically, I'd love to hear it. Tweet it at us. I'm
right.
at Alpha Knight on Twitter. You could hit us up together at GraphoCast. We would love to hear that article, but I suspect that we do not know and we will never know. But either way, it's an intriguing thought to know, is this the same gun that Philip used when he threw away his shot?
And Chernow notes that while Hamilton might have wanted to use these pistols in an homage to his son, most likely he just needed to confine knowledge of the duel to a tiny circle of confidants, and John Baker Church was one of those people that could keep that secret.
Right, it makes sense that he would keep it in the family, so to speak. And Hamilton didn't own these himself, own pistols that he could have used. And there were specific details worked out by the seconds about what types of pistols you could use. It could only be, I think, up to 11 inches long, and it had to be smooth barreled instead of grooves in it, because the smooth barrel made it less accurate, I think, as far as how the ball went out of the pistol. It was a little less accurate to use the types of guns they were requiring for the duel, but it's interesting, all of the details. There are entire essays written about these guns and the hair trigger and the barrel length and all of these things involved with it. It's intriguing to think about. And if you're interested in seeing these pistols, you can at the JP Morgan Chase headquarters in New York City. They have these guns pointed towards one another in a display case in a really intriguing way at the JP Morgan Chase headquarters.
Number 7. And as we'll know from 10 Duel Commandments, this is confession time. Burr's confession is that his fellow soldiers will tell you that he's a terrible shot. Well, that might be true in the musical, maybe, but not in history.
Yeah, in history, he had a reputation of being an excellent marksman. His correspondence beforehand said that he was practicing for months in advance of this duel, and one of the Republican defenders of Burr will later on say that he probably didn't have that much prep time, because there's not a single person who's ever held a gun that was as a dead shot as Aaron Burr. So there's no reason he would have needed to practice that much, because he's such a good marksman. So in the musical, we get to see him playing down his abilities somewhat. I wonder if this is more of him being an unreliable narrator, trying to make himself more of the victim of the story rather than the villain in the story, or whether it's just something we're supposed to accept on faith. But either way, historically, he had a better reputation than he's saying here.
Right. I feel like it's kind of playing up this paranoia that Hamilton's this great shot. I'm helpless in this situation. I might die in this situation. I might leave my daughter as an orphan. I have to come up and I have to shoot Hamilton. I have to take him down. It's that building of why he has to go after Hamilton in this.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. And then the next lines mirror exactly the 10 duel commandments when they say, number 8, your last chance to negotiate. Send in your seconds, see if they can set the record straight.
But we don't get to know what the seconds say to each other because Burr interrupts and talks over them. And then the staging, you actually see the seconds come at each other, but the light's not on them. So just in kind of darkness, they're conversing or doing something. And Burr just comes in and takes the spotlight and talks right over it.
Historically, the seconds were very active in this duel. There was a moment when Van Ness told Hamilton exactly the words he thought that would appease Aaron Burr in their correspondence. He had delivered the letter to Hamilton and said, this is what Burr wants to hear. If you say these words, then you will probably avoid a duel altogether. But Hamilton didn't write those words. He wrote something completely different. He did that dissertation on the word despicable. And so Van Ness was reluctant and finally went out of the way to do that. And so Pendleton and Van Ness had been active in setting this up, trying to come to a peaceful resolution. They could not get there. When you see it on the staging, they come together and you don't know what they're saying. You don't know what they're doing. You see them kind of moving around each other somewhat, but the true action is on the spotlight of Aaron Burr and what he's thinking about here. When he says the lines, they won't teach you this in your classes, but look it up. Hamilton was wearing his glasses. Why? If not to take deadly aim.
I really like that he's not singing those lines in the musical. He kind of breaks and he's just very serious, like, why? If not to take deadly aim.
Yes, this is a vindication of himself. This is something that a lot of Burr apologists will use to say Hamilton was wearing his glasses in this thing. If he was going to throw away his shot, why would he put on his glasses? Chernow has a comment saying maybe he put the glasses on so that he wouldn't accidentally shoot Burr, which is a little bit of a stretch if you ask me. It's a little bit of him trying to defend Hamilton when he doesn't necessarily need to do that, because he could point out any direction and not be at risk of hitting Burr. But all that to be said, the way this happened in their interactions, according to the seconds after the duel, there was a moment when, remember, Hamilton was facing towards the river and towards the city and the sun. And when Pendleton asks him if he's ready, he says, hold on a second, I'm a little bit upset by the waves that are crashing, the waves that are going up and down, the way the sun's looking in my eyes. That's when he got his glasses out, put them on his face, and lifted up his pistol, aimed it in a couple different positions, look around with his glasses on. And so he took a second to put his glasses on while they were still in their positions. And in his moving his pistol around, both seconds agree that Hamilton, for a second, stopped and aimed his pistol right at Aaron Burr, almost in practice of trying to line up the shot directly at him. So in that scene, Aaron Burr has no reason to suspect that Hamilton's going to throw away his shot. Hamilton expressed it to his friend Rufus King. He expressed it to his friend Nathaniel Pendleton. He wrote it in some correspondence, and both of his friends tried to talk him out of throwing away his shot. They thought, if you're going there, you might as well shoot in self-defense. You might as well defend yourself. Don't try to throw away your shot. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. But in this moment, Aaron Burr had no way of knowing. And here in the musical, we see that Leslie Odom Jr. is making that argument, saying, why would I ever think he was going to throw it away? Why would I ever suspect that? He put on his glasses, presumably to take deadly aim. And I love the next thought that Aaron Burr reveals in his lines, because I think this is the most intimate that he gets in his revelation, where his voice cracks. The smooth voice that is singing, wait for it, the smooth voice that is singing in the room where it happens, literally breaks when he sings, why, if not to take deadly aim? It's him or me. The world will never be the same. I had only one thought before the slaughter. This man will not make an orphan of my daughter. And the way his voice breaks always breaks my heart, because this guy I'm supposed to see as the villain has a kid, has a daughter. And yeah, historically, she's grown up and she's married now to a very wealthy man and has a large estate, and she's probably going to be taken care of as far as this point in history goes. The last time we heard about young Theodosia was in Dear Theodosia, when she was a child and a newborn. And so the reminder all of a sudden, for the first time in this act, that he is a father is very poignant and very touching to me, because we realize that both of these men have families and they're going to be missed.
Right. In contrast to this, while Burr does have that daughter, and we mentioned that she is grown up now, in history, Hamilton had a lot more children, and a lot of them were younger.
True.
Just to run through the list real quick, Alexander's going to leave Eliza the care for 7 children. Ages 19, ages 18, ages 16, age 11, age 6, age 4, and age 2. Eliza was left alone to care for 4 to 5 children, depending on who was in and out of the house at the time, and a disabled 19-year-old.
That's right. Eliza had a very heavy weight on her shoulders between trying to reconcile the debt and the credit that Hamilton left, and then also trying to deal with being a full-time mother of all of these kids in a house that she was eventually going to have to sell because she could not afford to feed them in it. It's very heartbreaking. And we'll get to talk more at the end of this musical about Eliza's response and how she handles things and how she is the boss and how she does take care of it incredibly well. But all the while, her longing for Alexander is very present.
Just to jump back a couple lines to that, it's him or me, the world will never be the same. Just because I can't resist from making my Les Mis references. It just reminds me of that Javert suicide. The lyrics, there is nothing on earth that we share. It's either Valjean or Javert.
Yeah, I love that. I don't like it when you bring up Les Mis without telling me about it, because the last episode you brought it up and I did this rant about one of my favorite characters in all of musical theater, Javert, Inspector Javert, and I accidentally inserted the name Jean Valjean a couple times when I was speaking about him, so I misnamed the person that I literally want to be in a musical. I would love to be Inspector Javert. I sang Stars in high school, and that song is so meaningful to me. The whole musical is great. So I apologize to everyone. If you were listening to that rant, you probably heard me speak nonsense for a second. But all that to be said, Les Mis is wonderful. And this is that moment where you see that it's one or the other. Neither can live while the other survives, so to speak. You have that Harry Potter prophetic moment. And historically, the world would never be the same for either of these men or for the world itself, because Burr's fate is sealed when he becomes the man who killed Alexander Hamilton. He is no longer going to be an insider in American politics. He still has a lot of connections and relationships, and he still has a lot of future ahead of him because he goes on and does the whole Burr treason, Burr conspiracy, and he has some interesting little shenanigans that he tries to pull in American history. It's fascinating what he does, but he is now an outsider for the political system, and America itself would have been a lot different if we had let Hamilton live to a certain age where maybe he would have influenced the next few presidencies. Maybe he would have regained his popularity and his support, and maybe he would have become a presidential contender like he probably expected, and maybe he would have led the military again. We don't know. We have no idea, because Burr did kill Alexander here, and the world will never be the same as when it had the Alexander Hamilton in it.
Yeah, the other worlds are just for our fan fictions now.
Right. I would love to live in that fan fiction dimension when Hamilton got to live longer and do everything he wanted to accomplish. If the Lord in his kindness would have given him what he always wanted and given him more time, then it would have been great to see what we could have seen out of Hamilton.
I do really like that Lin-Manuel loves Les Mis so much and has said that it's such an influence for Hamilton. And there was a ham-for-ham performance where Lin-Manuel Miranda and Leslie Odom Jr. coined this term Jabber instead of Javert to bring to light the connection there between the characters of Javert and Burr.
I like that a lot, Jabber. But I'm not going to try to remember it because then I'll just mess up the names again. Here we are now at number 9. Pendleton and Van Ness were unsuccessful in reaching a peace. They did not negotiate any resolution to this conflict, and so now the guns are out, and you get to see what is happening here. Number 9, Burr narrates, "Look him in the eye, aim no higher, summon all the courage you require, then count." And the company counts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Number 10 paces, fire.
Yep, there's that count, then fire. And now you're thinking we're going to jump into the soliloquy and talk all about it, but we're not. We're going to actually bring this to a close here. When that fire happens, the bullet starts to shoot out. The person who is the bullet, like we've mentioned before, runs up and slowly goes to move. And Hamilton starts the soliloquy. But there's so much in it that we're going to hold that for next time.
Right. We aren't trying to just stretch this out. We actively have a lot of things we want to dive into with this next portion of the song because there's a lot of stuff that happens in the fallout of the duel. When the shots are fired, it's the shot that's heard round the world, so to speak, and you hear there's an account that Nathaniel Pendleton gives, there's an account that William P. Van Ness gives to account for how the duel happened. There are things that Burr says about it, there are things that Hamilton's family says about it. There are a lot of different stories that surround what was happening here, not to mention all of the reliving of his life that Alexander Hamilton does when his whole life flashes before his eyes in this soliloquy. And it's an important moment that I think we want to stretch out, and we don't want to try to rush it into the last minutes of this episode. So we're going to pause here because a lot of the duel songs do end at the word fire when you hear the gunshots go off. But this is enough of a divide in this piece of music that it's appropriate here to pause and give all of the due diligence we can to what we have coming next.
So until next week, you still have time to send us questions for our Hamilton Patreon exclusive. For those who donate money to the podcast network, little as $1 a month will give you access to the feed to see all these exclusives that we do. Upcoming, we're doing a Hamilton one, and we want some questions from you to answer during that show, whether that's personal questions to us, wanting to get to know us better, questions in history for us to research, things about opinions that we have on Hamilton. If you want Robbie to speed rap some things, we would love that. So send in those requests. You can ask us basically anything that you want, and we will try to answer.
That's right. You can send us any request, any question you have at contact@graphocast.com. Or if you have a funny story you want to share, that would be another thing you could send to us in the email.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
It'd be really fun. We've had recently some people reach out to us. Our friend Mike on Twitter was able to send us a story about how our podcast has interacted with his life, and he shared us his story, and it was fascinating.
So amazing.
We loved that so much. So shout out to Mike. Very fun. If you have stories you want to share with us, let us know, and we can give some funny little stories or some fun anecdotes on that Patreon exclusive episode. It's going to be really exciting. If you saw the show and you want to tell us about your experience, send it to us in the email, and we will try to respond to that in the best way we can because it's really helpful. Another way you can reach out to us is obviously on Twitter. We're pretty active there. You can reach the podcast network at Graphocast, GRAPHOCAST, or me personally, I am at Alpha Knight.
And I am at Flesh Eater. And you can send us a direct message on Twitter if you would want as well. Or you could also leave comments on the website, graphocast.com. And one bit of pleading, if you would, please go check out our YouTube page and subscribe and like some of those videos. It'll help us get out there and for people to see those videos. And if you're on iTunes, please take a moment and give us a review. That's whatever you want to give us a review. Of course, we would love 5 stars, but whatever your opinion is, that's okay. You can actually just give a starred review, just 1 click, and I think you're done, maybe 2 clicks. Or you can actually write a review. The written ones will help more if people are trying to look and see if the show is any good. The star ones will at least help us be seen by other people and get more reviews so that we can climb in the ranks.
Until next week, when we give you the resolution of this cliffhanger that we're leaving you on, I am Robbie Herlocker.
And I'm Vinton Bain. And this podcast is wide enough for both Herlocker and me. This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, graphocast.com. Follow us on Twitter at Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.